Hey there, it's Mark Thomas Shaw, and I want to welcome you to the mini course on walking with the Christian mystics. If you're ready to start your journey with the Christian mystics, then this mini course is for you. I've been teaching people about the Christian mystics both online and in person for years, and I've seen people have all kinds of breakthroughs, whether experiencing a deeper intimacy with God, getting more deeply rooted in their Christian mystical tradition, which a lot of people leave Christianity to find because they don't know or haven't been taught that we've had this rich contemplative tradition within Christianity for centuries. Or maybe they're clergy or in healing professions and want to help other people move toward that greater freedom and wisdom the Christian mystics embody. I've got two other videos leading up to this one, the Divine Flowering, about the three major eras of the Christian mystical tradition, and the Divine Expressions, where we examine the four mystical types. And I really want you to get the most value possible out of these videos. So if you haven't seen those yet, go ahead and take a look, and I'll see you back here. Okay, here we go. So this video is all about next steps. It's about you moving forward and also having the clarity of a framework and some language around this very personal, very intimate, sometimes hard to articulate and define process of inner movement toward divine union or divine awareness. I want to talk about some of my own process. After I went through this breakthrough experience I described in video 2 of re-engaging with the Christian mystics and committing to this life rhythm of contemplative practice, over time I experienced just profound inner healing. But it wasn't all at once, and it wasn't even a linear process. In fact, Thomas Keating describes it being like a spiral. We excavate a new area, then let it go, and experience the corresponding movement into freedom and joy, only to come to a new area that has to be recognized. And we have to move deeper down to let that go. So that's the healing process, this upward and downward movement. And during one particular stretch, this strand resurfaced of deep inner resistance to life circumstances. And these phrases, this is not what I signed up for, or I feel like I'm living someone else's life, they just kept repeating over and over in my head. And this was after letting go in really important areas and experiencing profound movement in my life. After which I moved to a new job, a new town, experienced the deep joy of fatherhood. I had turned not only one corner, but really more like 20. But then I came to another period of isolation and mounting resentment and inner resistance. And it was this new plateau and another area to confront my inner negative tendencies, or what we call the ego, or false self, that always wants security, affection, power and control. And it was so helpful to have the teachings of these modern mystics like a Richard Rohr, a Thomas Keating, an Anthony de Mello, to not only make it through that time, but achieve deeper levels of insight and really blow the doors off my own limited understanding of who I was. And I had this awakening experience and this profound sense of inner levity, of this inbreaking of relentless joy, of profound peace, this burst of creativity and energy, after which I ended up writing a book in about 3 months. And it brought about this entirely new direction in my life and this laser focus on what matters most to me. So after some reflection, I was able to articulate that I want to help others move toward inner freedom and wholeness through contemplative teaching and practice. And of course, in the Christian tradition, almost all the contemplative teachings and practices can be traced back to the mystics. In fact, the stages of the Christian mystical path or divine transformation can be traced all the way back to Dionysius, and then down through different writers and teachers like John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing. But then in the late 19th century, the modern mystic Evelyn Underhill outlines the fivefold path, the stages of the Christian mystical life, and they are as follows: awakening, purgation, illumination, the dark night of the soul, and then divine union. Now, as with all things spiritual, it's kind of nonsense to think of these as these hard and fast steps or stages that are absolute, fixed, linear, or even always in that sequence. The key to keep in mind is movement, process. And it manifests itself differently in different lives, but there does seem to be these patterns to the process. And so this is a general outline. See, I believe what Heidegger said about poets also applies to the mystics at all times and in each era. In the age of the world's night, he writes, the abyss of the world must be experienced and endured. But for this, it is necessary that there be those who reach into the abyss. Now, sometimes this abyss contains our own woundedness in the unconscious, and we have to move through that to experience freedom. Sometimes the abyss is a kind of groundlessness beyond language and concepts, and the first reaction to that is deep anxiety and fear. But the mystic is one so devoted to the truth, they're willing to enter the abyss. And I honestly believe transformation in our world on a wide scale depends to a large extent on the degree to which we're able to move into the abyss and experience inner transformation on the individual level first, and then take action in the world that's rooted in genuine love, not tinged with egocentrism, with selfishness. So what's the process of divine transformation? What are these stages? Well, let's take a look at those. So this first stage, awakening, Underhill compares to a conversion experience, only it applies to the mystical life. We have some sudden shift, like having new perspective, new faculties. We're able to see the splendor and joy in the world. We awaken to the divine reality. And usually the shift in perception is hard to explain. There aren't quite words for it, which is why spiritual teachers like Jesus often use metaphors. But the experience itself is usually intense and constitutes this clearly marked shift in the inmost being. So Underhill and others note this usually comes after a period of stress and strain, of restlessness and uncertainty, a kind of inner suffering. Somehow, mentally or emotionally, the mind is backed into a corner and then finally surrenders into a higher order of being. And this period has different characteristics, a sense of all things made new, of liberation, of the presence or immanence of God, the awareness of divine beauty in creation, and so on. As St. Francis describes it, he experienced an inner tension, and then through this irrational impulse, he enters into this ruined church of San Damiano and was, quote, smitten by unwanted visitations, and then left different than he'd been when he entered. And the visitation he had was a vision of Christ, speaking to Francis, telling him to rebuild his house. And after that experience, his entire inner world was rearranged. Catherine of Genoa is another case where a woman oscillated from an unhappy marriage to comfort in religion, but then went through complete dryness and finally experienced a vision of unmeasured love, including seeing her own faults and misery and the goodness or infinite love of God. And then after awakening, there seems to be sacramental or sacralized perception, not as a doctrine or proposition or article of faith, but just this genuine first-hand experience. And then the next stage is the process of adjustment to this new level of perception and awareness. We tend to oscillate back and forth from this eternal level of perception into the default ego-driven awareness where we still get caught up in our attachments, our fears, our desires. So we need to go through a process of inner purification or purgation. And this is the process of inner alignment with this newfound level of awareness, a clearing of the obstacles that prevent us dwelling in divine love. And this stage has to do with learning to navigate the obstacles to this inner awareness, turning it from a state or something we experience for a short time to a permanent stage of development where somehow our inner center of gravity has moved into this new awareness. So what are the obstacles? Well, there are attachments, our distractions, preoccupations, our pain, our defense mechanisms, our habitual thought patterns, our conditioning. And before the awakening experience, most of this stuff is unconscious. don't really recognize it in ourselves. But once we've had an awakening and we've been able to see ourselves from this divine point of view, from 30,000 feet, you might say, there's a greater sense of inner awareness and of these dynamics and how they tend to play out. But awareness, of course, isn't mastery. It takes time to work with those patterns, to notice, for example, what makes us tense up or angry or reactive, and where we need to expand our awareness to the obstacles of the flow of divine love. We have to establish new neurological pathways even. We have to die to the old patterns of being. So what does this look like in practice? Well, practice really is the operative word. In ancient times, after an awakening, some of the Christian mystics formed monastic orders. And these were run by a rule of life, like the rule of St. Benedict, which prescribed pretty strict rules on how a monk had to spend their time. So there's this surrender of the self to a divine rhythm of prayer. And that was meant precisely for this purification period. But all outer effort is meaningless if it isn't the inner awareness that we keep in mind. So today there are practices, usually daily ones, like centering prayer, meant to frame our awareness for the day, to help maintain this inner and outer awareness, moment to moment. And the idea is to clear the space for God to heal and operate in and through us, to consent to the divine presence. The next stage of the journey, the stage of illumination, comes after a stage of discipline and effort. And it's marked by this consistent sense of being immersed in divine radiance. And though it contains a lot of substages and degrees and further adventures of the soul outlined in different ways by different mystics, it is characterized by a state of joy. In this stage, we're able to practice the presence of God, so to speak, to have this heightened perception or awareness of the absolute. We even perceive the physical world itself differently and usually experience heightened intuition. It can manifest in visions and so on. There's this sense of alignment and harmony between the inmost self of the mystic and life in all its forms. But then there comes a time for the mystic in this state when they realize the fruits of God are not that full experiential union with God, and there is a move away from what's called the illuminative way, or the first mystical life, and a movement into the dark night of the soul. Now, as described by the mystics, this stage is marked by stagnation and dryness. All the regular spiritual comforts of discipline and practice and daily rhythms don't provide any sense anymore of the nearness of God, and he seems utterly absent. There's a groundlessness, a spiritual disorientation. It's this fallow period after reaching the heights in the illumination stage. There's a sense of prolonged trial or even going to pieces altogether. It's much more than a period of sustained doubt or a time of depression. It's described by figures like John of the Cross, Madame Guyon, and Jean-Pierre de Caussade as a sense of complete withdrawal of the divine spark altogether. The mystic echoes Christ's words on the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" There's stagnation in emotion, will, intelligence, energy. And for some, even life circumstances now seem to conspire against them, almost like Job figures with losses mounting up in their lives. And when that work is done, the mystic experiences a complete helplessness and surrender, like a mystic death. And then this transition into the unitive life. And this is the next stage, divine union. This is the consummation of the contemplative life. And since it involves an ascent to another perspective or mode of being entirely, it's always a bit of a fool's errand to try to put it into words, but there do seem to be two kinds of descriptions worth noting here. The first is deification, or what Evelyn Underhill calls the transmutation of the self into God. And the other is the spiritual union or marriage of the soul to God. It's this dwelling in an overabundant outpouring of love, a sort of absorption into the infinite, purely being interested in the desires of God rather than the self. There's an acting out of this newfound divine authority, a sense of complete freedom. And the individual becomes a kind of spiritual center of gravity, a light that helps illuminate others. And the mystic in this stage seems to dwell in God experientially rather than as a statement of faith. Richard of St. Victor and Jacob Boehme write in different eras, entirely separately. Probably Boehme did not have access to the writings of Richard of St. Victor, but they write of the soul as like a metal put into the flame of love. And the metal grows hot, then melts, then becomes something else entirely, as if one with the fire, overflowing with abundant love, being carried beyond all things, beyond light and dark, into the divine will, penetrated by an incomprehensible light. And these are the sort of descriptions the mystics provide. So, invoking the image of communion, Roysbrook says, to eat and be eaten, this is union. Since this desire, Roysbrook says, to eat and be eaten, this is union. Since his desire is without measure, to be devoured of him does not greatly amaze me. So it's this shared ingesting. And all descriptions point precisely to this communion of love that is both immanent in the natural world and created order, and also transcends it. So this is the fivefold path of awakening, purgation, illumination, the dark night of the soul, and the divine union. So, where do I see myself on this path? Personally, I'd say after what I feel to be a genuine awakening experience, I oscillate between periods of extended purification and discipline and moments or states of illumination. But to me, the point isn't about recognizing what stage I'm in or even getting too attached to that label, though having that framework and language is hugely beneficial. It's the reassurance that there's more to come. There are others who have traveled this terrain and mapped it out to the best of their ability. I'm enfolded in that broader community and spurred on in my practice and drawn into the divine transformation, the divine life. And though my experience of awakening was acute and was sudden, there was an extended period leading up to it. And my current stage has lasted for several years. And I know of others who seem to have accelerated very quickly on their path during sort of certain key inflection points. But wherever you are in your process, there are a couple things I've found helpful that I want to share with you as well. So first, developing a daily practice, whatever that is, Lectio Divina, centering prayer, something else entirely. That daily rhythm is so important. And then identifying your mentors. Maybe it's a handful of living writers. Maybe it changes over time. Maybe it's a spiritual director. But the point is, these are figures who can help you apply spiritual wisdom in today's context with its particular confusions and cultural particularities. And then third, sharing the experience, a journal, a blog, a partner, a contemplative prayer group, a community, online or in person. It helps sustain us during difficult periods of lapsed or impossible practice to have those people with us on the journey. Some of these relationships may turn into opportunities for sharing your gifts through kind of mentorship, though not all contemplatives are called to be teachers, or just to be a listening ear. And then fifth, service. Identify real ways to connect in service and action. So many contemplatives tend to be introverts and are naturally drawn to the transforming silence. So it's helpful to find organizations or simple ways to serve. Since committing to a contemplative practice, I've joined organizations that work with the homeless, like Ignatian Spirituality Project, a community of Franciscan monks in the world, a Presbyterian church, and really several others, each of which provides a unique opportunity to serve in the world. And then if it gets too much, I've learned to give a firm, loving no to preserve my own boundaries and health as well. 6, immerse yourself in a living tradition. Whether you conceive of this as the perennial tradition, or wisdom that transcends denominational, even faith traditions, or whether you think of it as the Christian mystics, there's an appropriate time for a deep dive into a tradition to learn the subtleties, the nuances, the potential pitfalls along the way. And this is where you learn from the masters. I believe very few figures living today, and almost no famous figures or teachers I can think of, have ascended to that unitive life, to that final stage. So now that I've touched on some of that in this mini course, I want to go back to some of what I've shared so far. After my awakening experience, I recognized my purpose in life was to help others find inner healing and wholeness through contemplative practice and teaching. And what that means for you is inner freedom. Freedom of clarity and understanding, freedom of divine peace that passeth all understanding, freedom of being transformed, being healed from those obstacles to prevent the flow of divine love in and through you. And without this experience, I believe we all have boundless potential rooted in unlimited love that we're too preoccupied to recognize and consent to. And I've been teaching about the Christian mystics both online and in person for years, and it's been an amazing experience of genuine breakthrough and new insights people have through our coursework. We've had longtime contemplatives to college students just trying to figure it out, to people with terminal illnesses who felt drawn more profoundly into the contemplative life toward the end of their lives. And I'll share a little bit about that in the next video, but regardless of where you are in your journey, if you're ready to dive deeper into the lives of the Christian mystics and be more deeply rooted in this rich tradition, I do have a course that I'll be opening up with my co-founder at Contemplative Light in the next couple days called Living Sacraments, the Christian Mystics and the Inner Journey to God. This isn't the only way to progress on the spiritual path, and it's not for everyone, certainly, but if you made it this far, I'm pretty confident you can benefit from it. So here's how it works. Our course is open to enrollment all the time, but since you've taken the time to engage in this mini course, it tells me you're serious about your process. And since the primary purpose is to help those who want to take their inner life seriously, if you take the mini course, you're then provided with a gift code for about 30% off that standard course tuition. So my next video is going to be all about you moving forward. I'll have all the details about the Living Sacraments course and how you can get started. So look for that video soon. But in the meantime, I really want to hear about your next step on the inner journey. What does your path forward look like? What do you feel is the next step you need to take to open yourself more fully to the divine transformation? So scroll down, leave me a comment there, and don't forget to hit that like button. That helps spread the word to others and really expand our reach. We've been reading all the comments, and I've been responding dozens of them personally, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you. I'll see you in that next video.